Are diving into a really deep theological challenge today. We're looking at how to reconcile God's absolute oneness, his singular identity, with his simultaneous presence in multiple forms and locations. It's a concept that shows up across Genesis, the Gospel of John, the Quran, and even Isaiah.
Right, and the central disagreement we're going to get into is whether one specific framework, what we're calling divine multi-presence, is really the single necessary explanation for all of this.
Exactly. I'm going to argue that this structure, which is grounded in the idea that God's oneness is echad, a kind of unified plurality, is the cohesive spine that holds it all together, and that it basically makes competing ideas untenable.
And I'll be coming at it a bit differently. I absolutely acknowledge the textual evidence for this divine complexity. It's undeniable. But I really question if divine multi-presence has to be the exclusive structure. My concern is that in its effort to eliminate other options, the thesis might be, well, a bit too restrictive with its definitions, and maybe overlook some important functional roles we see in the text themselves.
Okay, so let me just lay out my position. I think the complexity we see here, it just demands the multi-present solution to maintain any kind of textual integrity across the canon. We're looking for one coherent structure, one God, multiple presence, one will. And this structure, it immediately makes opposing frameworks like simple substitution or mere role-playing, it makes them untenable. Because those ideas imply a kind of delegation that the text just explicitly deny. The definitive textual proof for me that seals this is Genesis 19:24. It's the ultimate self-reference. It says, YHW rained on Sodom and Gomorrah, fire from Yahweh out of the heavens. I mean, that grammar is absolutely critical. It proves that one divine name, YHW, is acting at the same time in two distinct locations. You have one Yahweh on earth, in effect, and the fire is coming from a second Yahweh out of the plural heavens, the Shamayim. That is the narrative display of multi-presence. And what's more, we are even given the metaphysical mechanism for how this works. John 1 says, the Word was God. And, just as critically, Quran 4171 defines Jesus as Allah's word and a spirit from him. So these texts, they converge to explain how this divine self-expression operates without being a separate, created entity, which gets rid of Arianism, and without just being different modes of the same entity appearing one after another, which gets rid of modalism.
I agree that the cross-textual convergence is, well, it's powerful, especially on the identity of the word or spirit. It's a very strong argument against any view that this figure is created or simply a mode. This is clearly divine self-expression. However, the rigor with which the multi-presence thesis tries to invalidate every other theory, it seems to rely on predefining terms in a way that I find a bit too stringent. For instance, and I'm sure we'll get into this, the reliance on the contrast between echad, which is unified oneness, and yaqid, solitary oneness, as the definitive proof against Unitarian isolationism. Now, that distinction is vital, I agree, but the question I have is, does the presence of plurality in the material necessitate this exact framework? I think the thesis might risk dismissing some very real, functional distinctions that the text itself establishes, particularly in the Genesis narrative. We see a divine identity stated, and then an immediate shift in designation, and I worry that just defining that away as a mere role overlooks a critical theological point.
Okay, let's focus right there then. The interpretation of agency and role in Genesis 18 and 19. My position is that the two figures who go to Sodom were never demoted. They weren't delegated. Genesis 18, verses 20 to 22, it's unambiguous. YHW says, I will go down myself. The judgment isn't outsourced. God himself initiates and carries out the action. So when Genesis 19:1 later calls them angels, this can only be a description of function, malak, messenger, not a species or a change in their actual identity. That one declaration by YHW, I will go down myself, it just disproves both angelic downgrading and delegated redemption in a single stroke.
I see why you lean so heavily on I will go down myself. It absolutely secures that non-negotiable divine agency. But let me offer a different perspective on that sequence. The text, I think, it very clearly structures a separation. Genesis 18:22 notes that the two men turn and go toward Sodom, while Abraham remains standing before YHW. Then you get this immediate shift in designation in the very next chapter, Genesis 19:1, to angels or messengers for the figures now entering Sodom. That introduces a functional separation that I think the role, not species interpretation struggles to fully contain. So the core challenge is this. If YHW insists, I will go down myself, why does the text immediately label the agents as messengers right at the moment that separation occurs? Isn't the text signaling a functional, maybe even temporary, subordination? A specific manifestation of authority needed for that task, even if we both agree it is not an ontological downgrade to a created being.
Well, the function of judging the cities requires an agent, yes, but the text is extremely careful to maintain the identity of that agent. That's the subtlety that the multi-presence framework handles perfectly. The one remaining with Abraham is still YHW. The two departing are also YHW, just acting in the capacity of messengers. The functional difference, one speaking, the others acting, does not, and I would argue cannot create an ontological division. If we allow the description of the role, the word angel, to override the stated identity, I will go down myself, we completely undermine the divine assurance given to Abraham. This is precisely why Genesis 19:24 is so indispensable. It's the textual seal. It confirms the identity by unifying the agency, YHW from YHW. So the specific vocabulary of angel has to be subservient to that explicit declaration of divine self-reference. God is more than capable of being his own messenger.
But the narrative tension just gets lost if we dismiss the role entirely when you define multi-presence so strictly that it has to be the full YHWA acting in multiple locations. You sideline the interpretive depth that an angelic downgrading idea, even if it's metaphysically wrong, is trying to address. It's trying to address the fact that God appears to assume a limited functional form for a temporary mission. So the argument that it's only a role doesn't really explain the textual choice to label it that way right at the point of action. It's an elegant solution, but it might be, I don't know, a little too reductive.
I would suggest that what you're calling reductive is actually a necessary precision. The multi-presence framework acknowledges the temporary functional limitation, the ability to walk and eat with Abraham. But it insists that this limitation is purely phenomenal, not essential. If we allow for a functional subordination that implies delegated authority, then we have to discard Genesis 19:24, which confirms unified authority in the judgment itself. The textual data is it's more cohesive under my interpretation.
That's a heavy lift, relying so much on that one piece of grammar. Let's pivot to how this same rigor is used to block substitution theory. The thesis claims to collapse Islamic substitution theory based on Quran 1933 and 4.158. And I agree, these passages absolutely negate the idea of some crude external replacement. A simple swap of identities is off the table. But the question is more nuanced. Does Jesus' statement about his own death and raising to Allah absolutely negate all complex forms of substitution? Or could a high view of substitution still align with the final divine act of raising his word and spirit to himself? If the figure is God's own self-expression, as we both agree, then the idea of a temporary, divinely orchestrated assumption of a substitute body for the cross, followed by the immediate raising of the word/spirit back to himself, that might still be compatible with the text.
A high view of substitution is that multi-presence it explicitly replaces the need for it. God doesn't need a replacement or a stand-in precisely because his word is his eternal self-expression, present in multiple locations without being replaced. When we bring John 1, the word is God, together with Quran 4:171, Jesus is the word and spirit from him, we have the metaphysical definition of a divine self-expression. Substitution in any form implies that God is replacing the presence of this divine word with something else, even for a moment, which compromises the singularity of the Redeemer. Isaiah 44:6 is emphatic. YHWH alone is Redeemer. If any part of salvation is outsourced to a substitute, that statement is fundamentally weakened. The resurrection being raised to himself, is just the confirmation of this continuous divine identity, which, again, Genesis 19:24 already established as a principle. God acting in two places without replacement. Why would you introduce a substitute when the fundamental principle allows for the divine self to be the agent?
I'm sorry, but I don't buy that the textual requirements are met solely by this framework. The texts, they undoubtedly require profound non-delegated divine action, yes. But the argument for multipresence relies on predefining the scope of Allah's word and spirit in the Quran as metaphysically equivalent to the word in John 1, specifically to block substitution. It feels like a definitional move to eliminate a variant rather than letting the Quranic statements stand on their own rich interpretation of what raised to himself means. If we step back, raised to himself implies a return to a specific divine state. Substitution theory might argue that the divine word returns to the divine presence, leaving the earthly vessel to its fate, which accommodates the complexity of the events while maintaining the word's nature.
Text intends to establish a unique theological dimension around that final exalting act.
But the consistency across the material is paramount. If we accept substitution, we have to accept that the eternal Redeemer requires an external agent, a replacement, to complete his work. That contradicts the core unity we see everywhere else. Multi-presence is the only solution that simultaneously maintains the absolute oneness and the non-delegated nature of the divine identity while allowing for physical action in the world. Which brings us back to the foundation, the lexical proof, the primacy of Akkad. This is what truly collapses Unitarian isolationism. The core principle is in the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4. YWH is Akkad, unified oneness. Now, to be clear for everyone listening, Akkad is always used in the text to describe a compound unity, like a cluster of grapes, or a married couple becoming one flesh. It stands in direct contrast to the word Yahid, which means solitary or utterly isolated. The lexical choice in the Shema confirms the necessary internal plurality that Genesis 18 and 19 had already revealed in action. That linguistic precision rejects any later simplification of monotheism into just isolationism.
I agree completely. That distinction between Echad and Yahid is crucial. It demolishes any simplistic view of monotheism. Echad clearly shows that unity is complex, but I question whether the use of Echad necessarily mandates the specific structure of multi-presence, the whole YHW from YHW paradigm, as the only valid theological outcome. Couldn't Echad simply denote a profoundly complex, unified Godhead, a mystery of unity, without requiring the detailed spatial, self-referential interpretation from Genesis 19:24 as the singular definition of that plurality? I mean, the term Echad might allow for a broader conceptualization of God's unity, one that still maintains distinctions between presences, even if they aren't ontological downgrades. Complexity often requires multiple perspectives, and maybe restricting the meaning of Echad to this one grammatical reading limits the scope of that unity.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. The word Echad provides the grammatical space for plurality, but it's the narrative of Genesis that provides the actual content of that plurality. The text demands we link the two. The grammatical evidence of Genesis 19:24, YHW acting with YHW out of the plural heavens, Shamayim, that provides the necessary content for Echad. The vocabulary is simply the crown language that seals the logic already on display. If Echad is just some general term for complexity without that specific content, then we're left without any solution for the dual action in Genesis.
I acknowledge the coherence of connecting the lexicon to the narrative. You've shown that the text provides both the linguistic requirement, Echad, and the narrative evidence, Genesis 19:24, for divine plurality in action. My core disagreement really just remains on the exclusivity, whether this is the only viable structure or simply the one with the highest explanatory power that still leaves a little room for nuance around those functional differences the texts themselves describe.
To summarize my position then, the structure remains textually unavoidable. One God, multiple presence, one will. The coherence across Genesis, John, the Quran, and Isaiah, all sealed by Genesis 19.24, and the definition of Jesus as the Word from God in Quran 4.171, it demands this specific solution to maintain consistency and eliminate those variants that rely on delegation or substitution.
And I'll summarize by saying I acknowledge that the concept of divine multipresence is a powerful, I'd say, essential tool for explaining this textual convergence. It successfully defends the high divinity of the figures involved. However, the rigor with which you collapse alternative theories by strictly defining role and leaning so heavily on that specific reading of Echad, it suggests to me that while the texts demonstrate profound plurality, the final framework might still be open to further nuance.
And that really is the value of this kind of rigorous challenge. It forces us to define our terms and ensures our theological structure accounts for every textual detail.
Indeed, this discussion only deepens our understanding of how complexity and unity are simultaneously maintained in these foundational texts. And there is clearly much more to explore here.